They told him America was where enemies smiled before they hurt you. Hans Keller was 12 years old when the ship touched American soil, and by then he had learned that fear could live inside a body like a second heartbeat. It was August 1945. The Atlantic had been behind them for 14 days, gray water stretching forever, steel walls humming at night like something alive. Hans sat on the cold metal floor of the cargo hold, his knees pulled against his chest, his fingers wrapped tightly around the only thing he had left from home, his father's pocket watch. It no longer worked. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at 4:17, but Hans carried it anyway. It was heavy in his palm, heavier than its size should have allowed, as if all the weight of Germany had settled into that broken circle of silver. Around him, dozens of German children sat in silence, boys and girls between 10 and 16, all dressed in faded gray clothes, their shoes worn thin from too many roads and too many camps. No one spoke much anymore. At sea, words felt expensive. Above them, boots moved across steel decks. American boots. Hans listened every night, waiting for anger in those footsteps, waiting for cruelty to announce itself. But it never did. That frightened him more. Before they'd boarded in France, an officer had leaned down, his tired face hard in the pale morning light, and told them one thing: never trust the Americans. They will smile. Then they will break you. Hans remembered that sentence now as the ship groaned against the dock. The sound of metal scraping would echo through the hold. Morning light slipped through the cracks overhead. Someone shouted in English. Fast. Sharp. Unfamiliar. A younger boy beside Hans started shaking. Hans tightened his grip on the watch. This was it. America. The enemy's land. The place from stories and warnings and whispers. The place where monsters lived. A soldier opened the steel hatch above them, and sunlight poured in so suddenly it blinded everyone below. Move! Came the order, not cruel, just firm. Hans stood with the others, his legs stiff from the voyage, and climbed the iron steps one by one. The air hit him first. Salt. Warmth. Freshness. Real air. Not the sour smell of too many bodies trapped below deck. Hans reached the top and stopped. Everything below him looked wrong. The harbor was alive, but untouched. Huge cranes moved cargo. Trucks rolled over clean pavement. Men shouted to each other like it was any normal morning. Buildings stood whole. Windows unbroken. No smoke. No ruins. No ash floating in the sky. Hans stared at it all, unable to breathe for a moment. This wasn't what war looked like. Back home, war had a smell. Burned brick. Wet dust. Hunger. But here, the morning smelled like ocean water and coffee. Somewhere close, he caught the scent of fresh bread. His stomach tightened so hard it hurt. Then he saw them. American soldiers waiting at the dock. Tall. Clean uniforms. Rifles hanging at their sides. Watching. Hans lowered his eyes immediately, waiting for the first blow, the first scream, the first proof that everything he had been told was true. But it didn't come. Instead, one soldier near the gangplank glanced at Hans, looked at the small broken watch in his hand, and said quietly, almost to himself, "Kids carrying time like it still matters." Hans didn't understand the words. But he understood the voice. It wasn't hate. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. Hans stepped down onto the wooden dock expecting shouting, expecting hands to shove him forward, expecting the sharp edge of humiliation that had followed him through every camp since the war ended. Instead, the dock moved with a strange kind of order. American soldiers directed lines with short hand signals. Clipboards. Names. Numbers. Nothing loud. Nothing cruel. The sun sat low over the harbor, warm and gold, turning the water into moving glass. Hans squinted against it, his boots touching American ground for the first time. It felt ordinary. That was the first thing that confused him. The enemy's land was supposed to feel different. Darker somehow. Dangerous. But the wood beneath his feet was dry from the morning heat, and somewhere beyond the rows of trucks and uniforms, He could hear gulls calling over the water. Normal sounds. Human sounds. Ahead of him, the children formed a line beside folding tables where soldiers wrote down names. Hans watched carefully. One girl, maybe 14, stepped forward first. Her hands shook as she answered questions in broken English. The American clerk wrote quietly, barely looking up. Then he handed her a metal cup filled with water. Just water. She stared at it for a moment like it was a trick. Hans felt his stomach tighten. Maybe this was how it began. Kindness first. Then something worse. The line moved. Step by step. Hans could smell fresh coffee now, stronger than before, drifting from somewhere nearby. It mixed with engine oil and sea salt and something else he could not place at first. Bacon. Real bacon. He had not smelled bacon in more than 2 years. Back home, food had become memory before it disappeared completely. He remembered mornings before the war, his mother frying breakfast in a black iron pan, sunlight touching the kitchen table. That memory hit him so suddenly it made his chest ache. The line stopped. Hans looked up. A soldier stood in front of him. Broad shoulders. Dust on his boots. Blue eyes, tired but steady. The same soldier from the gangplank. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore. He looked older up close. Maybe 34. His face carried the kind of exhaustion Hans had only seen on grown men who had survived too much. Thomas looked at the clipboard, then at Hans. Name? He asked slowly. Hans froze. The English sounded sharp and fast. He looked down. Thomas repeated it, softer this time. Your name? Hans swallowed. Hans Keller. Thomas nodded and wrote it down. No insult. No laughter. Just writing. Then Thomas looked at the pocket watch still in Hans's hand. Your father's? Hans understood only one word. Father. He nodded once. Thomas said nothing after that. He only reached for the metal bucket beside the table, dipped a cup into cold water, and handed it to him. Hans stared at it. His fingers stayed still. Thomas seemed to understand the hesitation. Without a word, he took another cup, filled it from the same bucket, and drank first. Slow. Calm. Then he set it down. Proof. Hans stared at the empty cup in Thomas's hand. Every warning in his mind began to crack. Slowly, carefully, Hans took the water. It was cold against his fingers. Cleaner than anything he had tasted in months. He drank. The cold hit his throat and spread through him like rain on dry earth. For a moment, the world around him blurred. Not from fear. From confusion. Behind the tables, trucks rolled past carrying supplies. Wooden crates marked with food. Bread. Milk. Fruit. Hans watched an American boy on the far side of the fence, maybe 8 years old, running beside his mother with a baseball glove in his hand, laughing like the world had never broken at all. Hans stood there holding the empty cup, staring at that child, and for the first time since leaving Germany, one thought entered his mind that felt more dangerous than fear. Maybe they had lied about everything. The line moved faster after that. Names were written down. Ages counted. Small paper tags tied to sleeves with thin string. Hans stood still while an American medic checked his hands, his face, his eyes. The man said nothing except simple instructions. Turn left. Look up. Hold still. It felt less like captivity and more like being measured by a machine. Efficient. Clean. Predictable. Hans did not understand that. Back in Germany, every checkpoint had carried fear like smoke. Here, it felt almost dull. That frightened him in a different way. When the processing ended, the children were guided toward a train waiting beyond the harbor yard. Hans stopped when he saw it. He had expected boxcars. Dark wooden walls. Locked doors. Straw on the floor. That was how prisoners traveled. That was how soldiers traveled at the end. Packed tight, standing for hours. Sometimes days. But this train was different. Painted silver. Windows polished clean. Steps with iron rails. Passenger cars. Real ones? Hans looked at the rows of glass windows reflecting the morning sun and felt his stomach twist again. It made no sense. Around him, the other children slowed too, staring with the same disbelief. A boy beside Hans whispered in German, "This is for us?" No one answered. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore walked beside the line, checking names against the list. He noticed Hans staring at the train. "Keep moving, kid," Thomas said, his voice calm. Hans did not move at first. He touched the silver watch in his pocket, grounding himself. The metal felt warmer now from his hand. Step by step, he climbed into the train car. Inside, the smell hit him first. Soap. Clean cloth. Fresh wood polish. The seats were soft blue fabric, worn but comfortable. Real cushions. Overhead racks. Wide windows. Hans stood in the aisle, frozen. He had not sat in a seat like this in years. Maybe ever. Across from him, a little girl no older than 10 pressed her fingers into the fabric like she was checking if it was real. It was. Hans slid into the seat by the window, stiff and uncertain. Outside, the harbor stretched wide under the August sun. Workers loaded crates. Soldiers walked with coffee cups in their hands. Everything moved with purpose, but no panic. No hunger. No ruin. Thomas stepped into the car, moving down the aisle with another soldier carrying paper bags. Hans watched carefully. The bags were handed out one by one. Food. Hans felt his breath catch. When Thomas stopped beside him, he held out a small brown bag. Hans hesitated. Thomas opened his own bag first. Pulled out a sandwich. Took a bite. Chewed. Swallowed. Again proof. Hans took the bag. Inside was white bread, thick slices with ham and cheese. Real cheese. There was an apple too. Bright red. Clean. Hans stared at it like it belonged in another world. For a moment, he could not move. Across the aisle, children were already eating, slow at first, then faster. Quiet tears on some faces. Hunger had made eating feel unreal. Hans lifted the sandwich carefully. The bread was soft in his hand. Softer than anything he remembered. He took one bite. Salt. Warmth. Real meat. His eyes closed before he could stop them. The taste was too much. Not because it was rich, but because it was normal. Simple food. Ordinary food. The kind that had disappeared back home long before the war ended. The train gave a low whistle. Then it moved. Slowly at first. Steel against steel. Through the wide window, Hans watched the harbor slide away. He expected fences. Guard towers. Isolation. Instead, the tracks led straight into the heart of America. Streets full of cars. Stores with bright windows. People carrying shopping bags. A woman pushing a baby carriage. Men laughing outside a diner. Hans pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Life. Just life. Beside him, the pocket watch sat heavy in his coat pocket, frozen in time. But outside the window, time had never stopped at all. The train rolled south through Virginia, steady and smooth, the wheels humming beneath the floor like a low song Hans could feel in his shoes. He sat pressed against the window, the empty paper bag folded neatly in his lap, unwilling to throw it away. Even the bag felt strange. Clean paper. No grease stains. No scraps left behind. Across from him, the little girl with the pale braids had fallen asleep with half an apple in her hand, her head leaning against the glass. Around them, the car was quiet except for breathing, the soft rustle of clothing, and the sound of the tracks carrying them deeper into a country Hans could not understand. Outside, America moved like a picture book. Green fields stretched for miles, unbroken by shell holes or burnout machines. White fences ran beside the tracks in straight lines. Red barns stood clean under the afternoon sun. Cows grazed lazily in open fields, their black and white shapes moving through tall grass. Hans watched them and remembered his grandfather's farm near Leipzig, before the uniforms, Before the speeches, before war had turned every field into something to survive instead of something to grow. A boy 2 seats ahead leaned into the aisle and whispered, "It looks untouched." Hans understood exactly what he meant. Untouched by hunger. Untouched by fear. Untouched by the long shadow that had swallowed Europe. The train slowed near a small town, and Hans leaned closer to the window. There were houses with front porches. Curtains moving in open windows. A gas station with bright signs. A grocery store with baskets of fruit stacked outside the door. Fruit left outside. Not hidden. Not rationed. Just there. People walked the sidewalks carrying paper bags filled with food. One man carried 3 loaves of bread under his arm like it meant nothing. Hans stared at the bread until it disappeared behind the station. His mind could not make sense of it. Back home, bread had become a memory measured in crumbs. Here it was carried openly in sunlight. The train stopped for water near a crossing, and for the first time, the children were allowed to step onto the platform for a few minutes. Hans climbed down slowly, his legs weak from sitting. The heat wrapped around him, thick and warm, smelling of cut grass and hot wood. A woman stood near the station with a basket in her hands. Older. Gray hair pinned neatly back. She watched the children quietly. Hans lowered his eyes, expecting judgment. Instead, she stepped towards Sergeant Whitmore and spoke softly. Thomas nodded. Then the woman moved down the line, handing out small wrapped pieces of candy. Peppermints. Hans looked at the candy in his hand, white paper twisted at both ends. He had not seen candy since before the war. He looked up at her, confused. Why would a stranger give candy to enemy children? The woman smiled, tired but warm, like someone looking at her own grandchildren. Hans unwrapped it and placed it on his tongue. Sweetness flooded his mouth so suddenly it almost hurt. Pure sugar. Sharp and cold. Beside him, another boy began to cry silently, not from sadness, but from the shock of remembering sweetness existed. Thomas stood near the train door, watching the children without speaking. His eyes moved over them like he was counting more than bodies. Hans noticed something then. Thomas did not look at them like prisoners. He looked at them like survivors. That difference sat heavy in Hans's chest. When the whistle blew again, they climbed back aboard. Hans sat by the window, the taste of peppermint still cool in his mouth, watching the town disappear behind them. For the first time, fear was no longer the strongest thing inside him. Something else had begun to grow. Doubt. Not about America. About everything he had believed before stepping onto that dock. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the train had changed. The wheels no longer felt sharp against the rails. They had settled into something steady, almost gentle, like the train itself knew its passengers had nowhere else to be. Hans had stopped counting miles hours ago. Distance meant little now. America felt endless. Field after field. Town after town. Every mile showed him the same impossible thing. Life untouched. At one point, the train passed a baseball field beside a schoolhouse, and Hans pressed his hand against the glass. Boys about his age ran across bright green grass in clean white uniforms, laughing, throwing a ball under the hot sun. Their voices carried through the open train window for just a second. Sharp laughter. Easy laughter. Hans stared until they disappeared behind trees. In Germany, boys his age had learned silence. Learned waiting. Learned how hunger changed the sound of a house. But these boys played games in daylight like tomorrow was guaranteed. Hans could not stop thinking about that. Across the aisle, a thin boy named Emil leaned forward. "Do they not have war here?" he whispered in German. Hans looked out at the clean roads and white church towers passing by and answered honestly. "I do not know." But the question stayed with him. As evening came, the golden light softened across the fields, and the train finally slowed again. This time it stopped at a larger station. Red brick. Wide platform. Painted signs. Hans expected another inspection, more orders, but instead, the doors opened and the smell reached them first. Hot food. Real hot food. Meat. Bread. Soup. The smell filled the car so quickly that every child sat up at once. Hunger woke inside them like something alive. 2 American workers stepped aboard carrying metal containers and trays, followed by Sergeant Whitmore. Thomas moved carefully down the aisle, handing out bowls and spoons, his face calm, almost tired. Hans took his bowl with both hands. It was warm against his fingers. Too warm. Real warmth. Inside was thick stew. Potatoes. Carrots. Beef. Real pieces of beef floating in dark broth. Steam rose into his face, carrying the smell of pepper and onions. Hans stared at it. His stomach twisted painfully. It was too much. Too rich. Too sudden. Across the car, some of the younger children began eating immediately, spoons shaking in their hands. One little boy burned his mouth and laughed anyway, unable to stop. Hans lifted the spoon. Slowly. The broth touched his lips first. Salt. Heat. Flavor. The kind of flavor that made the body remember what it had lost. He swallowed and felt warmth spread into his chest. The second bite came easier. By the third, he was eating fast, almost afraid it might disappear. Thomas stopped beside his seat and watched him for a moment. Slow down, he said quietly. Hans looked up, confused by the softness in the voice. Thomas pointed at the bowl, then at his stomach, making the meaning clear. Too fast would hurt. Hans slowed. Across from him, the little girl with braids smiled for the first time all day, stew on her chin, eyes brighter than before. For a few minutes, the whole train car changed. Spoons against metal bowls. Breathing. Eating. Silence, but not the silence of fear. The silence of relief. When Hans finished, he held the empty bowl in his lap and looked out the window again. The station lights glowed yellow against the coming dark. Families stood on the platform saying goodbye to soldiers heading somewhere else, hugging, smiling, waving. Life moving forward. Thomas returned with a small carton of milk and placed it beside Hans without a word. Hans looked at it. White milk. Cold. Fresh. Another impossible thing. He looked up at Thomas, wanting to ask why. Why this kindness? Why this food? Why this care? But the words stayed trapped inside him. Thomas gave a small nod and moved on. Hans touched the pocket watch in his coat again, feeling its broken weight. For the first time, he understood something strange. Time had stopped for him back in Germany. But here, on this train, with warm food in his stomach and milk in his hand, it felt like time had started moving again. Night came slowly through the train windows, stretching long shadows across the seats and turning the glass black until Hans could only see his own reflection staring back at him. The fields outside disappeared first, then the fences, then the roads, until all that remained was the occasional porch light in the distance, glowing like a candle against the dark. The train kept moving. Steady. Endless. Inside the car, the warmth from the stew still lingered in the air, mixed now with soap, cloth, and the faint smell of coal smoke drifting in through the cracks. Most of the younger children had fallen asleep. Heads against windows. Arms folded tight. Breathing softer now that hunger had loosened its grip. Hans stayed awake. Sleep felt impossible. Too much had happened in one day. Too many things that did not fit the world he thought he knew. Across the aisle, Emil whispered into the dark. "Do you think they will send us back?" Hans did not answer right away. He watched his reflection in the glass. Thin face. Hollow eyes. Older than 12. Finally, he said, "I do not know." That answer felt honest. For the first time in months, the future was not a wall. It was a road, and Hans could not see where it went. A few rows ahead, a baby began crying softly. Not from fear. Just tired. An older girl rocked him gently until the crying stopped. Hans watched that and thought of his mother. Her hands. Her voice in the kitchen before dawn. The smell of coffee and bread before the world changed shape. He had not allowed himself to think of home in weeks. Thinking of home made hunger sharper. Made loss heavier. But tonight, surrounded by strange comfort, memory returned without warning. The train slowed again some time after dark. Not at a station this time. Just a pause near a crossing. Through the glass, Hans saw a small farmhouse sitting alone under a porch light. Yellow light spilled through the windows. Inside, through the curtains, he could see people sitting at a table. A family. Eating. Talking. Living. It was such a small thing, so ordinary, but Hans could not look away. Thomas Whitmore walked through the car one more time, checking on everyone. Quiet steps. A flashlight in one hand pointed at the floor so it would not wake the sleeping children. When he reached Hans's seat, he stopped. "Still awake?" Thomas asked. Hans understood only the shape of the question. "Awake." "Yes." Hans nodded. Thomas leaned against the seat beside him and looked out the same window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas pointed at the pocket watch peeking from Hans's coat pocket. "Broken?" Hans pulled it out and nodded. Thomas held out his hand, asking permission. Without words. Hans hesitated, then placed the watch in his palm. Thomas turned it over carefully under the dim light. Silver scratched. Glass cracked. Old. Important. Thomas opened the back cover, studied the gears, then closed it gently. He handed it back. "My father fixed watches," Thomas said quietly, more to himself than to Hans. Hans did not understand all the words, but he understood father. Understood watches. Thomas tapped his own wrist, then the watch in Hans's hand, and gave a small smile. Something simple. Human. Hans looked down at the frozen hands on the face. 4:17. A moment trapped forever. The train started moving again, and Thomas straightened up, heading toward the next car. Hans held the watch tighter this time, but it felt different now. Less like the weight of what he had lost. More like proof that something from before still remained. Outside, the darkness rolled by like deep water. Inside, the car was warm. Safe. Quiet. Hans leaned back into the soft seat and closed his eyes, but not to sleep. He was listening. Listening for cruelty. For proof that all this kindness was temporary. But the only sound was the train carrying him forward into a place that felt less like the enemy with every passing mile. The train reached its destination just before dawn. Hans woke to the sound of brakes grinding softly against steel, and the low hiss of steam rising into cold morning air. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The blue seat beneath him felt too soft, too clean. Then memory returned all at once. The harbor. The food. The long miles of American fields sliding past the window. Around him, the other children stirred slowly, rubbing their eyes, pulling thin coats tighter against the morning chill. Outside the glass, the world was gray with early light. Pine trees stood in long rows beyond the tracks, their dark shapes cutting into the pale sky. A wooden sign stood near the platform, painted in white letters Hans could not read. The train doors opened, and cold air rushed inside. It smelled different here. Wet earth. Pine sap. Morning dew. Fresh. Real. Hans stepped down onto the platform, his boots touching gravel this time instead of wood. The station was smaller than the harbor, quieter, hidden deep in the countryside. No city sounds. No crowds. Just birds waking in the trees and the distant sound of trucks starting somewhere beyond the camp gates. Ahead of them stood rows of long wooden barracks painted white, lined up with military precision behind tall wire fences. Hans stopped walking. There it was. The prison camp. The thing he understood. Fences made sense. Rules made sense. For a second, relief passed through him. Something familiar. Something that fit the world again. But as they walked through the gates, that feeling changed. The camp was clean. Very clean. Gravel paths swept smooth. Barracks with glass windows unbroken. Flower beds near the entrance. Actual flowers. Yellow and red, planted beside a prison gate. Hans stared at them, confused by such a useless beauty in a place meant for prisoners. Inside the main barracks, the floors were polished wood. Real beds stood in neat rows, each with white sheets folded tight and wool blankets stacked at the foot. Hans stopped beside the nearest bed and touched the blanket. Thick. Warm. Clean. Across the room, Emil sat on his mattress and laughed once under his breath, a dry sound filled with disbelief. "It is softer than my bed at home," he whispered. Hans looked at his own bed and said nothing. A guard handed each child a towel, soap, and clean clothes. Fresh cotton shirts. Socks. Underwear. Simple things, but things Hans had not held in months. He looked at the soap in his hand, turning it over. It smelled like lemons. The scent was so sharp and clean it almost made him dizzy. Before sunrise, they were guided to the washroom. Long rows of sinks. Running hot water. Hans touched the metal faucet and jumped when the warm water hit his skin. Warm water. Not cold. Not rationed. Warm. He washed his face slowly, watching dirt and salt disappear into the drain. In the mirror above the sink, he barely recognized himself. Cleaner now. Younger somehow. Less like the boy who had crossed the ocean. Breakfast came at first light. A bell rang outside, sharp and clear. Hans followed the others into the mess hall, expecting thin soup, maybe bread if they were lucky. Instead, trays waited on long tables. Scrambled eggs. Toast with butter. Oatmeal. Milk. Coffee for the older children. The smell filled the room like home, if home had ever been safe. Hans sat down, staring at the plate in front of him. Steam rose from the eggs. Real butter melted into the toast. He looked around the room. No shouting. No guards watching like wolves. Just routine. Order. Food. Sergeant Whitmore stood near the doorway, coffee in hand, watching the room wake up. Hans looked at him, then at the plate, then back again. Something inside him shifted. Not trust. Not yet. But the shape of fear was changing. He had spent months preparing for cruelty. But cruelty had not come. And in the quiet light of that American morning, sitting in a prison camp that smelled of coffee and clean linen, Hans realized something he had never expected. Kindness could feel more confusing than hunger. The first full day inside the camp moved with a rhythm Hans had almost forgotten existed. Morning bell. Breakfast. Roll call. Quiet instructions. Everything happened at the same time, in the same order, like the world here trusted tomorrow enough to plan for it. After breakfast, the children were taken outside into the yard. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the gravel paths and turning the pine trees bright green under the clear sky. Hans stood in line with the others, his clean shirt stiff against his skin, still not used to wearing clothes that smelled of soap instead of smoke and dust. Across the yard, American soldiers moved between buildings carrying supplies, clipboards, boxes of canned food. Their steps were steady. Ordinary. Not the heavy march of conquest Hans had imagined. Just men doing work. A camp officer read names from a list, assigning beds, chores, and meal times. Simple things. Order. Predictable. Hans listened carefully, understanding only pieces, but enough to know one thing: they were not being treated like enemies. They were being managed like guests who could not leave. That difference mattered. Later that morning, Hans was assigned to help carry linens from the supply building to the barracks. It was not hard work. Clean sheets folded in. Neat stacks, warm from the laundry room, smelling of soap and steam. Hans carried them with Emil beside him, both boys moving in silence under the weight of something unfamiliar, calm. No urgency. No shouting. At the doorway of the supply room, Hans saw Sergeant Whitmore sitting on a wooden crate, sleeves rolled up, working on something small in his hands. Hans slowed. It was a watch. His watch. The broken silver pocket watch. Hans stopped so suddenly Emil nearly walked into him. Thomas looked up, noticing him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Thomas held up the watch, turning it in the morning light. The back was open. Tiny gears exposed like the inside of a living thing. Hans stared. Found a bent spring, Thomas said, tapping the inside carefully with a small tool. Hans understood almost nothing except spring and watch, but the meaning was clear enough. Thomas had taken the watch sometime during the night after Hans fell asleep, likely from where it had slipped beside his bed. Not stolen. Repaired. Hans stepped closer, the stack of sheets heavy in his arms. Thomas worked slowly, steady hands, careful fingers. Hands used to fixing things instead of breaking them. Hans thought of his father at the kitchen table, repairing small clocks for neighbors before the war, his glasses low on his nose, saying every machine deserved patience. Thomas closed the watch, turned the crown once, and held it to his ear. Tick. A tiny sound. Soft as breath. But alive. Hans felt something stop inside him. Then start again. Thomas held it out. Hans set the sheets down, and took it carefully. The second hand moved. Small circles. Forward. Alive. Hans stared at it, unable to speak. The watch had been dead for months. Frozen in the moment his father disappeared into war. Now it moved again. Thomas pointed at it, then tapped his own chest. My father taught me, he said. Hans understood father. Taught. Enough. He nodded once, gripping the warm metal in his palm. It felt lighter now. Not because it weighed less. Because it carried less grief. Around them, the camp moved on. Boots on gravel. Wind in the trees. Distant voices. Ordinary sounds. But Hans stood still, staring at the moving hands of the watch, and felt the wall inside him crack for the first time. Not from food. Not from clean sheets. Not from warm water. From this. A man he had been taught to fear had repaired the last piece of home he had left. No orders. No reward. Just because it mattered. Hans looked up at Thomas, searching for the trick, the hidden reason. But there was none. Only tired blue eyes and a quiet nod before Thomas stood and walked back to work. Hans slipped the watch into his pocket, the ticking steady against his chest like a second heartbeat, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt seen. That night, Hans lay in his bunk staring at the wooden ceiling above him, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness. Beds creaked softly as children turned under wool blankets. Wind moved through the pine trees outside, brushing against the barracks like quiet hands. Somewhere in the distance, an American guard laughed at something another man said, the sound low and ordinary, fading into the night. Hans held the pocket watch against his chest beneath the blanket, feeling its steady ticking through the fabric of his shirt. Tick. 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 For months it had been silent. Dead metal. A frozen memory. Now it moved again, measuring time like it had never stopped. Hans closed his eyes and listened to it. It sounded like home. But not the home he had lost. Something new. Something unfinished. Morning came with pale light through the barracks windows and the smell of coffee drifting in from the mess hall. Hans sat up slowly, surprised by how deeply he had slept. No fear had woken him. No shouting. No cold. Just sleep. Real sleep. Outside, the camp was already alive. Boots on gravel. Doors opening. Birds moving through the trees. The world continuing. At breakfast, the same trays waited. Eggs. Toast. Oatmeal. Milk. Familiar now, though still impossible. Hans sat beside Emil, both boys eating slower this time, no longer afraid the food would disappear. Across the room, Sergeant Whitmore stood near the doorway with his coffee, speaking quietly to another guard. Hans looked at him differently now. Not as the face of the enemy. Not as a soldier. Just a man. A tired man who knew how to fix broken things. After breakfast, the children were allowed outside for an hour in the yard. The sun was warm, the sky clear, the air carrying the smell of pine and cut grass. A truck arrived at the front gate bringing supplies. Crates of canned food. Fresh bread. Milk bottles packed in ice. Hans watched the workers unload everything with practiced ease. So much food. So much order. So much certainty. It felt unreal. Near the fence, Hans saw something that stopped him. Beyond the camp road, just past the trees, a small American farmhouse stood on a hill. In the yard, 2 children played catch with a baseball, their dog running circles around them. Their mother stood on the porch hanging laundry in the sunlight. Simple things. A family. A dog. Clean shirts drying in the breeze. Hans stared at them, and something inside him shifted into place. Yesterday, he had crossed an ocean expecting monsters. Today, he was watching children laugh in the morning sun, less than 100 yards from a prison camp, and nothing about it felt cruel. Thomas walked up beside him, hands in his pockets, following his eyes toward the farmhouse. For a moment, they stood there in silence. Hans looked down at the watch in his hand, then back at Thomas. The words in English were hard, but he forced them out. "Why good?" Thomas looked at him, understanding the question immediately. Why the food? Why the bed? Why the watch? Why the kindness? Thomas took a slow breath and looked toward the house on the hill. "Because war ends," he said. Hans understood only part of it, but enough. Thomas pointed at Hans's chest where the watch rested beneath his shirt. "And kids are just kids." Hans looked at him, the words settling slowly into meaning. Not prisoners. Not enemies. Children. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the supply truck and coffee from the mess hall. Hans looked at the farmhouse, the laughing children, the ordinary morning, and felt the truth settle inside him with the weight of something undeniable. He had come to America carrying fear like a wound. But it was not cruelty. That changed him. It was breakfast on clean plates. Warm water from a metal faucet. A peppermint from a stranger. A repaired watch ticking over his heart. The stories he had been given had prepared him for hate. No one had prepared him for kindness. And standing there in the morning light, Hans understood the strangest thing of all. Sometimes the first day in a new world does not break you. It breaks the lie you carried into it.